A ferry crossing in the mist, a man with too many names, a file that was never meant to surface. When revenge wears the face of justice and silence arrives in a rain-soaked coat, only one mind can unravel the truth hidden in fog and surgical scars. This isn't just a murder case, it's a story of guilt, grief, and the anatomy of lies laid bare inside a brownstone where orchids bloom and no motive escapes dissection. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. If you've ever spent a Tuesday morning in Nero Wolfe's brownstone, with nothing but drizzle on the window panes and the smell of Polish sausage simmering down from Fritz's domain, you'll understand the particular kind of boredom that seeps into a man's bloodstream. I was halfway through a back issue of Life and the crossword from yesterday's Gazette when I heard the rain shift. Not stop, mind you, but shift, the way it does when it's deciding whether to sob or settle. Wolfe, naturally, hadn't moved. He was seated in the big chair under the globe lamp, a volume of Plutarch balanced in one hand and a glass of beer untouched at his elbow. Before noon, Wolfe didn't speak unless provoked, and even then, only in monosyllables that might have served equally well in Latin or Morse code. It wasn't that he was grumpy, he just found the morning hours offensive to civilization. I had just hit 24 down, obscure as motives, when the front door buzzer gave a single, firm ring. Wolfe's eyelid rose precisely 1/16 of an inch. That was as far as it went. I, being the junior partner in muscle and mobility, stood up and said what had to be said. "Well, it ain't the milkman, sir. Shall I get it?" Wolfe didn't answer, which, as usual, meant yes. She had the kind of presence that didn't ask permission before entering a room, but still managed to apologize for existing. The woman on the stoop gave her name as Mrs. Eloise Bainbridge, and the moment she stepped into the front room, I could tell she hadn't come about a will or a wayward dog. She was mid-30s, maybe older, depending on how many truths her makeup wasn't telling. Tailored navy coat, wet at the hem, gloved hands clenched around a leather handbag that cost more than my last suit. "I didn't telephone first," she said, with a glance that skimmed over the furniture like it had done something wrong. "Evidently," Wolfe rumbled. "Yet you arrived. Mr. Goodwin, take her coat." She didn't sit until Wolfe gestured, and even then she perched like the chair was rented. Her lips pressed together before she spoke, a sure sign the next sentence was going to be unpleasant. "It's about my husband," she said. "Dr. Lennox Bainbridge." I raised an eyebrow. That was a name that carried weight in the downtown hospital circuit. Or had, until a few months ago. Wolfe didn't blink. "Is he dead?" "He's missing," she said. "Since yesterday morning." "Missing," Wolfe repeated, as if the word offended his vocabulary. "In the ordinary sense, or in the sense employed by sentimentalists?" Eloise Bainbridge straightened her back. "He boarded the Staten Island ferry yesterday. He was seen arguing with a man, someone he didn't know, near the lower stern rail. The crew says they separated before docking, but no one saw Lennox disembark. He hasn't come home. He hasn't telephoned. I've called every hospital." "And the police?" She hesitated. "They said he's an adult and adults vanish all the time, usually with someone younger and named Ginger." I'll give her this. She wasn't dull. Wolfe leaned back, steepled his fingers and closed his eyes. "And you believe he's in danger?" "I don't know what to believe," she whispered. "But something's wrong." There was a silence. Wolfe didn't speak and I didn't either. The rain had settled into a polite, steady rhythm, like it had decided to sit in on the conversation. "A ferry," Wolfe muttered finally. "A man vanishes on a ferry. If that sounds like interest, let me translate." It was. I offered her coffee. She refused. I offered a tissue. She declined that too, which told me she was either holding something in or holding something back. "There's been no report," she said, eyes fixed on the rug. No announcement, no article. It's like he dissolved into the Hudson. Wolfe was not impressed. Madam, men vanish daily, hourly, some intentionally, others carelessly. But Lennox didn't vanish for pleasure. He had patients. He had a lecture scheduled at Lenox Hill. The hospital bearing his name, Wolfe asked with a touch of irony. It's where he trained. He was recently suspended. That slipped out like an afterthought, but I clocked it. Wolfe didn't react, which in his case meant he absolutely did. Suspended why? I asked. Eloise looked up. That's why I came here, because I think the reason may be why he's gone. The room was quiet again. The kind of quiet Wolfe used to let fools hang themselves or clients lean forward. This time, it was the latter. Madam, Wolfe said, and I could already hear the dismissal coming, this is a house of deduction, not of despair. You have brought no facts, no retainer, and no crime. I could see her tense, not with anger, but something more like shame. Wolfe caught it too, but didn't flinch. You offer a disappearance with no corpse, no police involvement, and no meaningful event beyond an argument witnessed by an anonymous crewman. This is the realm of gossip and fog. You don't believe me? I neither believe nor disbelieve. I evaluate. Mr. Goodwin, please see Mrs. Bainbridge to the door. I didn't move. She did. I'm sorry to have troubled you, she said quietly, and reached for her bag. Wolfe said nothing, which made his silence feel louder than most men's shouting. She stood to leave. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she pulled something from the bag and set it down on the corner of Wolfe's desk. That was when things changed. It was a newspaper folded to the obituaries, not today's. It was last Sunday's Times. The page was spotted with rain or something like it, and across the top margin, written in hurried block print, were 7 words. He won't testify. He'll be silenced first. Wolfe didn't lean forward. He didn't need to. His eyes sharpened, like a camera adjusting for focus. Who wrote this? He asked. I don't know. You found it where? In my husband's coat pocket. The coat was in the hall closet. Which he wore when? Sunday night. He said he was going to walk. And he returned? Yes. But the paper was from earlier that day. She nodded. I stepped forward and took the paper. The ink had bled slightly. Water-soluble. It hadn't been there long. There's no name, I said. But it was meant to be found. Or meant to be missed, Wolfe murmured. A warning poorly disguised as trash. Eloise said nothing. Her hands had unclenched. Wolfe studied her. Not her story, her. He was weighing not what she told us, but what she hadn't. He said, Mr. Goodwin, a photograph of Dr. Bainbridge, if she has one. I knew right then he wasn't ejecting her after all. She gave me a photo, neatly tucked in a wallet sleeve, black and white, professional. Bainbridge in a white coat with a surgeon's poise and a smile like a closed door. Wolfe didn't look at it long. He nodded once, then turned to her. You may leave the clipping, he said. That will be all for now. Eloise Bainbridge blinked like she'd expected more or less, or something different altogether. She rose, composed herself, and left the room without another word. The door clicked shut behind her. I turned to Wolfe. That was almost gracious of you. He didn't respond. He lifted the paper again and stared at the scribbled warning like it was the first sentence in a book he hadn't decided whether to finish. I had barely turned toward the hallway when the front door opened again, this time without a chime or a knock, which meant one thing: Kramer. Inspector Fergus Kramer, proud owner of a gravel-coated voice and a wardrobe that hadn't seen a tailor since Prohibition, came in dripping from the collar and fuming from the ears. "Don't even get up," he said. "I know I'm not welcome." "That is correct," Wolfe said without lifting his gaze. "Nor are you invited." I took the coat, mostly because it was already puddling on the floor. Kramer didn't wait for formalities. "There's a body, Wolfe. Staten Island Ferry. Male, mid-40s, stabbed. Name's not confirmed yet, no ID. But rumor has it he was seen arguing with someone before he died." That made Wolfe pause. Kramer pointed at the obituary page, still on Wolfe's desk. "You've been sniffing around this already, haven't you?" Wolfe didn't answer. I did. "Kramer, who said anything about dead?" Kramer didn't answer me. He just lit a cigar, bit down hard, and glared at Wolfe like the man had personally written the homicide rate. I watched them for a beat, the cop and the orchid, and then leaned on the edge of the desk, turning the newspaper over in my hands. So the man arguing with Bainbridge on the ferry was now dead, so Bainbridge was missing. So Mrs. Bainbridge walked in before lunch with a scribbled threat. I lit a cigarette and let the first drag hang in the space between Wolfe and me. "What's a surgeon doing disappearing on a ferry?" I said aloud. "And why the hell are you suddenly listening?" Wolfe didn't speak. He just reached for the beer. There are few things in life more sobering than retracing another man's final footsteps, especially when those steps vanish somewhere between point A and point dead. By the time Wolfe had sent me out to verify the details of a vanishing, I had already begun to suspect this wasn't going to be one of our cleaner gigs. Staten Island Ferry, Monday morning, 9:32 a.m. departure from Whitehall Terminal. Cloudy sky, medium chop on the water, and a full roster of commuters clutching paper cups and the illusion of punctuality. The ferry logs showed 64 passengers boarding. One of them was Dr. Lennox Bainbridge, confirmed by 2 separate ticket takers and a concession girl who described him as surgical-looking, which struck me as both apt and grim. At 9:47 a.m., a mild commotion occurred near the aft stairwell, described by one deckhand as an argument and by another as 2 guys having words. One of the 2 was later identified as Marcus Vale. The other looked like the doctor, according to a woman who worked the vending machines. At 10:02 a.m. the ferry docked. Everyone disembarked, except Vale, who turned up dead below deck. And Bainbridge? No exit recorded, no footprints, no phone calls, no return address, only a name suspended in fog. It took Kramer the better part of 6 hours to confirm what I already suspected, that the dead man below deck was Marcus Vale. Name, age, partial employment history, and a resume as fuzzy as a bad X-ray. No next of kin had come forward, but 2 different precincts had flagged him on separate occasions. Nothing stuck, but the file had that whiff, the kind that made bureaucrats sweat and federal men keep copies in locked drawers. He was listed in customs paperwork as an import consultant, which was technically true if you counted medicine from Belgium, whiskey from Ireland, and truths from nowhere. His fingerprints turned up in one FBI inquiry from 52, and then disappeared again just as quickly. I asked Kramer if that meant anything. "It means he had friends in useful places," he growled. Wolfe was unimpressed. "Names without meaning are smoke." Still, Vale's name had surfaced, and that was enough for Wolfe to lift an eyebrow, which in that room carried more weight than a dozen subpoenas. The Staten Island Ferry is not known for its luxury amenities, but it does have a crew access corridor below the passenger deck, a place passengers aren't supposed to be. That's where Vale was found, stretched out near a rusted bulkhead, with a narrow blade sunk neatly into the soft flesh just under his left ear. No wallet, no watch, no struggle, just one man, quite dead, in a place no civilian should have been. The medical examiner's report said the cut was professional. That was the word they used. Not efficient, not precise, but professional. I read that sentence twice before handing it to Wolfe. He read it once. The killer was either trained, lucky, or maliciously poetic, he said. Perhaps all 3. One crewman recalled seeing Vale headed below deck shortly before docking. Another remembered a man following him, tall, with a doctor's bag. "And you thought nothing of it?" I asked. "I thought he worked there." If Bainbridge was the man following him, then we had 2 options. He went down, he came up, and no one noticed, or he never came up at all. If you want eyewitness statements, ask a ferry crew. If you want truth, you ask the coffee vendor. Her name was Rosa, and she ran a stand just off the gangway. I found her halfway through her second cigarette and offered her a third. "Yes, I saw the doctor," she said. "He was in a hurry, black case, long coat. not like the others. Before or after the docking? She exhaled. After, maybe 2 minutes. That raised an eyebrow I didn't have time to arch. You're sure it was him? I saw his picture in the paper. Same face. He was wearing one of those ferry uniforms, but it was too big. Like borrowed. Back at the brownstone, I relayed the story. Wolfe grunted once. If Bainbridge was seen leaving, he is not dead, he said. Or someone wants us to think so. He didn't argue. He just lifted his glass, stared at it, and said, The facts remain insufficient, but the contradictions have grown succulent. That was Wolfe for keep digging. I expected him to leap. Well, maybe not leap, but commit. Instead, Wolfe reached for the beer that Fritz had brought in and sipped it like it contained answers, and he wasn't entirely pleased with the vintage. So, Bainbridge may be alive, I said, and Vale is definitely dead. That's not nothing. It is less than something, he replied. It is a framework without flesh. Come on, a vanishing act, a dead man, and a woman who shows up with a death threat written on an obituary? That's enough to start charging by the hour. He shook his head. A corpse is a prerequisite. A client is preferable. A crime that affects my equilibrium is essential. At present, we have fog, theatre, and coincidence. Which, translated from Wolfe-ese, meant not yet. But I'd seen it already. The tilt of his fingers, the way he hadn't returned the photo of Bainbridge, the page from the Times still resting on his desk. He was circling. He just hadn't pounced. Digging into Marcus Vale was like digging into rain. His name appeared on 3 LLC filings, 2 import-export agreements, and 1 sealed court document from 1949 that refused to open for me or the secretary of the clerk's office. No family, no verified address, and the only person who admitted knowing him did so with the disclaimer, in a strictly professional capacity, which is New York code for we weren't friends and don't ask more. The few medical contacts I found listed him as a procurement liaison, which sounded like he spent more time in back rooms than boardrooms. One nurse referred to him as the man with too many friends and no last name. When I asked Wolfe if that qualified as useful intelligence, he said, It qualifies as an unsolved equation, which is preferable to a solved error. Which meant, in short, keep going. Somewhere in the filings was a shell company that tied back to a midtown clinic, and that was where the trail turned warm enough to melt Wolfe's frost. Her name was Carla Reyes, and she didn't open the door so much as appear behind it. Slim, wide-eyed, with a scarf that looked like it hadn't been tied, just survived. She wasn't surprised to see me, which is either a sign of guilt or city-born fatigue. Yes, I knew Marcus, she said, before I even asked. And yes, I know what happened. What do you know? That it's not the first time someone went missing after questioning the Bainbridge study. That perked me up. I didn't interrupt. She told me Vale had been looking into a set of clinical trials, poorly documented, questionably approved. Bainbridge's name had come up as a consultant on one of them. They called it post-surgical behavior correction, she said. But it was just chemical suppression. Side effects were buried. People got hurt. Vale was going to publish? She nodded. And Bainbridge? She hesitated. I think he wanted to help. I think he backed out. It was the kind of half-truth you could fold in a jacket and carry like guilt. When I left, I called Wolfe from a payphone. He didn't ask questions, he just said, "Get back here." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was not in his chair. He was standing, which, if you know the man, is something you record in a calendar. He had a stack of Ferry security stills in his hand and a frown on his face that could have frightened a tax collector. I came in and shut the door. "You have something?" I asked. He handed me a photo. It was grainy, black and white, time stamped at 10:04 a.m. The angle was bad, but the man's face was visible. It was Bainbridge, except he wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a conductor's coat, 3 sizes too big, collar turned up, head down, walking off the ferry like he had every right to be there. I stared. Wolfe said nothing for a moment, then, "This is not escape. This is rearrangement." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that one of them was supposed to be the corpse, and now we must decide which one was disappointed. You don't often see Nero Wolfe concede to reality before lunch unless the refrigerator malfunctions or Fritz burns the bread. But that morning, as I recounted Rosa's confirmation of Bainbridge in Ferry uniform, slipping off the deck like a ghost with a clipboard, Wolfe responded not with scorn but with a phrase so rare I made a mental note of the time. "This case," he said, "is mildly offensive to reason." Now, from Wolfe, that's not the sound of a door opening. That's the entire front of the house coming off its hinges. It meant he had started thinking, genuinely thinking, not in the abstract recreational sense, but in the dangerous real-world way that tended to result in police visits, threats of litigation, and orchids left wilting while a murderer got cornered. I didn't comment. When a man like Wolfe decides to care, you let him pretend he doesn't. He took a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer, uncapped his fountain pen, and in neat Roman capitals wrote a name. Dr. Lennox Bainbridge. Then he sat back, fingers steepled, and said, "Send for the widow." Eloise Bainbridge returned, in a suit that had lost its confidence and a face that had shed its defences. She entered the office with fewer pearls and no perfume, which was probably for the best, since Wolfe considered cologne a war crime. She sat without being invited, which Wolfe didn't comment on, possibly because she no longer seemed the type who required permission. Wolfe looked her over, not like a man, but like a judge, measuring the tremble in a voice he hadn't yet heard. "Madam," he said, "you did not tell me your husband had been suspended from St. Benedict's Hospital." She looked up, startled but not surprised. "You already knew?" "I rarely inquire without result." Her lips pressed into a pale line. "He refused to authorize a batch of cardiac regulators. New model, rushed through trials. The board said he was insubordinate." "Was he?" She hesitated. "He said the devices were unstable. He said someone was being paid to look the other way." "And was he?" Wolfe murmured. "The only man looking straight?" "I think so, which is why—" Wolfe held up a finger. "No conclusions, only facts. What did he carry on the ferry?" "A black leather case, locked." He nodded. So did I. When she left, Wolfe didn't move. He sat perfectly still, the tips of his fingers pressed together as though holding up an invisible dome of logic, and spoke without looking at me. "If a man intends to disappear," he said, "he does not bring a companion, he does not draw attention, and he most certainly does not engage in a public altercation." "Unless the plan went sideways," I offered. "Even sideways has shape," he replied. "He was seen in uniform. He disembarked. The argument was seen, and someone was murdered. These are not variables, they are constants." "So Vale was the target? Or Bainbridge was, or both? But we are being handed a corpse and asked to believe the illusion was the crime." "Then what was the crime?" He finally looked at me. "Misidentification," he said softly. "The most elegant disguise is a corpse mislabeled." And that was when I realized he didn't believe either body, yet belonged to who they were supposed to be. Roy Brisby was the kind of man who wore his conscience like a wet undershirt, visible through the seams and hard to ignore. I found him at a corner cafe near 6th and West 48th, staring into a half-drunk coffee like he'd forgotten what he was drinking it for. He flinched when I said his name, which was a good sign. "You knew Bainbridge?" I asked, sliding into the booth. "I was his rep," he said. "Farmer liaison. I'm not involved." That was also a good sign. People who aren't involved don't say so in the first 10 seconds. "He carried a case on the ferry," I said. "Heavy?" Brisby blinked. "Yeah, said it had reports, research." "What kind?" He swallowed hard. "Internal audits, patient outcomes, trial failures, nothing admissible." "Nothing clean, you mean?" He didn't answer. "He mentioned anyone being upset? Threats? Pressure?" Everyone was upset. The board, the surgeons, the investors. That case, he paused. It was like a bomb in leather. I paid the bill and left him staring at the dregs. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe asked only, "Did he sweat?" "Like a faucet," I said. "Good," Wolfe said. "Then he was telling the truth." Wolfe's Rolodex is older than the American Medical Association, but twice as selective. He doesn't call acquaintances, he summons relevance. That afternoon he spoke with 3 names from Bainbridge's surgical years, all men who'd held a scalpel long enough to carve reputations. "Lennox," said one, "had hands like calligraphy and nerves like cable. You didn't like him, but you didn't outvote him." Another was less poetic. "Brilliant, yes, but also precise to the point of cruelty. He once refused to close on a patient because the incision wasn't clean enough." Wolfe nodded through all of it, murmuring once, "And did he keep records?" "Oh, Lord, yes," the third said. "His office looked like an archive, locked drawers, alphabetical color codes. We joked it was the best file room west of the Vatican." After the last call, Wolfe looked at me. A man who organizes secrets with that degree of care does not vanish by accident. "And if he vanishes on purpose?" Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Then he has left behind the pieces he knows we cannot help but find." And we had found one. The black leather case. I gave Wolfe the 2 possibilities as plainly as I could, not because he needed them, but because I did. Either Bainbridge staged the argument and vanished to avoid being silenced, or someone killed him to make sure he didn't speak, and then used the Ferry as a theatre stage. Wolfe didn't interrupt, which for him is high praise. "You've missed a third path," he said when I'd finished. "Ego." "Ego?" Men who guard truths become their own vaults. Bainbridge believed in his own invincibility. Men like that don't prepare exits. They issue ultimatums. Then who killed him? I don't know yet, but I do know this. He brought the evidence. He wanted to be seen on the ferry. Either he was delivering it or daring someone to stop him. So which happened? Wolfe closed his eyes. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. And then, softly, or perhaps it was never Bainbridge who meant to vanish. That gave me something to chew on. And I didn't like the taste. It was just before dinner when the phone rang. Fritz answered it, spoke a few words in clipped German, and brought the receiver in like it had teeth. "Inspector Kramer," he said. "He is agitated." Wolfe waved me to take it. Kramer didn't waste syllables. "You want it clean or dirty?" "Give it to me like your coat," I said, unfiltered. "We got a second body, washed up near the Staten Island dock. It's Bainbridge." I said nothing. ID'd by his surgical scar and dental records. No question this time. "What about the face?" "Hard to say. It's been 2 days in the river." I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe didn't speak. He was slicing a pear with the kind of focus that only came when things had gone sideways. "It's Bainbridge," I said. "Confirmed." He paused, knife suspended. "So the man in the uniform?" "Still unidentified." Wolfe nodded once, slow. "A man is murdered in the wrong coat," he said, "and another dies with his name." And as the knife bit into the fruit, I felt the first drop of something colder than juice, the sense that the killer hadn't made a mistake. They had made a plan. The morgue isn't my favorite place to spend a morning, but when you work for Nero Wolfe, your calendar doesn't always respect your personal taste. I'd been dispatched, Wolfe's word, to observe the post-mortem on the man confirmed as Dr. Lennox Bainbridge. The coroner was a man named Barstow, who had a beard like a misplaced hypothesis and a scalpel grip you didn't want aimed your way. He didn't waste time. The body was waterlogged, but intact enough to work. No signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no trace of a weapon. But there was one thing. A small incision below the sternum, clean and deliberate, just shy of textbook neat. It didn't belong to the stab wound that killed him. It didn't belong at all, Barstow paused, tweezers in hand. This one, he muttered, was done by someone who knew what he was doing. Not the killer, not forensics. Someone like, well, Bainbridge? You mean he cut himself? I asked. Barstow didn't answer. He just raised his eyebrows and stitched the dead man closed with the same kind of care a tailor gives silk. Back at the brownstone, I told Wolfe. He looked pleased, which coming from him meant furious. Wolfe took the report from my hand like it was a telegram confirming an old suspicion. He scanned it with narrowed eyes, paused at the mention of the incision, and tapped a finger once, the way a man might test a plank for rot before stepping forward. Below the sternum, lateral, clean entry, minimal blood displacement, he read aloud. Barstow is not prone to metaphor. If he calls it surgical, it was. Meaning? He looked up. Meaning it was Bainbridge. Bainbridge performed surgery on himself? I doubt it, though it would amuse the poets. He rose, and began pacing, which in our universe is equal to full-scale alarm bells. More likely, Bainbridge made that incision, but not on himself, and not during the ferry crossing. You think he made it on Vale? No, Wolfe said sharply. I think it was made as a signal, a mark left on a man before the final curtain, not for treatment, for recognition. That's a grim calling card. It is also clever, he murmured. Too clever for a coincidence. He sat again, heavy with implication. And then he said, we must consult their teeth. Wolfe wasn't being poetic. He meant dental records. And when Wolfe says we, it generally means me. The task was mine. Chase down the dental charts for two men, one officially dead, the other unofficially missing. The Bainbridge file was easy. Eloise provided it without hesitation, though I caught a flicker behind her eyes when I said what it was for. You're not sure it's him, she said, almost to herself. I didn't confirm or deny. Marcus Vale was trickier. No spouse, no siblings, no insurance trail. But there was one out-of-date insurance file buried at the Manhattan General Office under the name Mark Vellier, which Wolfe suspected had once belonged to him in a past life. The match was close enough to bite. I brought the folders back and placed them on Wolfe's desk. He didn't open them. Not yet. Have you ever wondered, he asked, what it feels like to wear another man's face? I said I'd stick with my own, but I knew what he meant. Wolfe leaned forward. Let's see who we've been burying. Carla Reyes's apartment smelled like someone had tried to erase themselves in a hurry. Lemon polish, overused incense, and something sour beneath it all. The place was neat, but too neat. Drawers were empty, no dishes in the sink, closet hangers swinging like recently orphaned question marks. The landlord didn't know anything except that her rent was prepaid, and her name didn't match the one on the lease. One neighbor said she'd seen Carla leave the day before with a small suitcase and a man in a navy windbreaker. Didn't look like a boyfriend, the woman said. Didn't talk, he just nodded. She looked scared. I asked for a better description. She shrugged. Looked like a courier or a cop out of uniform. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the summary. He rubbed his chin. She was removed, not running, lifted. A disappearance facilitated by another party. Voluntary? He tilted his head. Fear can masquerade as choice. That was Wolfe's way of saying, we've lost her. And we both knew it wouldn't be the last time someone vanished without telling us why. She arrived 15 minutes late, which told me she was trying to decide whether to come at all. Lorna Fielding was the ferry stewardess who'd poured the coffee, handed out life jackets, and, as luck would have it, watched two men have words before one of them ended up dead and the other disappeared into a borrowed coat. Her file said she was 27. Her eyes said older. I met her at the door. She was wearing a navy sweater and a worry she hadn't yet put down. She didn't need directions to the front room, just a moment to catch her breath before walking into Wolfe's orbit. He didn't rise, naturally. He greeted her with a nod and an observation. You know what I want. She sat slowly. Yes. Her hands folded in her lap, but the fingers kept moving, a silent metronome counting down to the part she hadn't rehearsed. Wolfe said nothing. I took the chair opposite hers and waited. After 30 seconds, she gave in. "I'll tell you what I can," she said, "but not all of it's mine to tell." Which, in our line of work, is where most of the good parts begin. Wolfe let the silence stretch long enough to make her squirm, then broke it with a single word. "Vale." She nodded. His real name was something else. I never knew it. He had papers in 3 names, maybe 4. On the ferry, he was M. Valentine. "You were involved with him," I said. Her eyes flicked to me, then away. Briefly, until I saw what he was doing. "And what was that?" She hesitated. "Trading documents, patient reports, selling them to someone offshore. I don't know who. I swear I don't. But they were from the hospital." From the device trials, Wolfe's voice was low. "And Bainbridge?" I thought he was trying to stop it. Then I thought he was helping. Then I didn't know. "Where were you during the stabbing?" "In the service corridor," she said. "I heard something. A thud. When I went down, the area was empty, but the door to the engine hold was open." "And the case?" She bit her lip. It was gone. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again like shutters. "You're holding something back," he said. She met his gaze. "Yes," she whispered, "but not for him. For me." When she left, Wolfe remained quiet for precisely 10 seconds, long enough for the weight of her contradictions to settle over the room like dust on lacquered wood. Then he said, "She is neither a liar nor an innocent." "You expected both?" I expected neither. What I received was grief in costume. I'd stopped trying to translate Wolfe's poetic turns years ago. I waited for the rest. He leaned back. "Let us suppose the simplest answer is false, as it often is. Let us say that Vale and Bainbridge collaborated. Fraud, extortion, call it what you will. Vale decided to vanish with the earnings. Bainbridge followed to stop him. And they switched identities?" Wolfe gave a slow nod. "It is the only model that allows for 2 men, both present, both known, and both dead, without clarity on who was which when. And someone misjudged the costumes." "Precisely. One was meant to live, one to die. The wrong man wore the name." He reached for a pencil and began sketching names on the blotter. Someone knew, and someone made a correction, which meant we still didn't know which corpse was whose mistake. It was 11:47 p.m. when the phone rang. Wolfe had just turned the final page of Tacitus, and I had just poured a last glass of milk, a ritual more symbolic than satisfying. Fritz had gone upstairs. The world was quiet. I answered. "Is this Mr. Goodwin?" The voice was clipped. "Laboratory forensics. Serious. We've completed the comparative dental analysis," he said. "There's been a mix-up." "Define mix-up." "The body identified as Bainbridge, not Bainbridge." I was silent. "And the one you believe to be Marcus Vale?" "Also not Vale." I thanked him, hung up, and turned toward the big chair. Wolfe had not moved. "Switch confirmed?" he asked. "Worse. Neither body matches either man." His mouth tightened. "Then the deception was not accidental. It was constructed, not for concealment, for substitution." He leaned forward and tapped the blotter with his index finger once. 2 names, 2 corpses, 0 certainty. "And someone knew it all along," I said. Wolfe looked up at me. "Yes, but we have not yet determined who benefited from knowing." And suddenly the bodies weren't puzzles, they were pieces, and we were still short one hand to place them. I had the theory worked out before breakfast, and by the time the eggs came up from Fritz, it was dressed in logic and ready for trial. It had Vale and Bainbridge colluding on a blackmail scheme, Vale double-crossing his partner, and the 2 men switching identities on the ferry, one to vanish, one to take the fall. Maybe the wrong man ended up dead, or maybe that was the plan all along. Either way, it sounded crisp, symmetrical, and reasonably plausible. I laid it out to Wolfe while he salted his eggs. I even paced a little, for effect. He listened with his eyes half closed, chewing with grave concentration, and didn't interrupt until I was done. Then he set down his fork. "Archie," he said, "you have committed an error both charming and ruinous." "Oh?" "You have mistaken sequence for consequence, a fatal indulgence of the amateur." "Meaning?" He lifted one brow. "You wish it to fit, so it does." I opened my mouth, but he silenced me with a finger, and added, "As Plutarch wrote of Pompey, he desired the storm, and so mistook the thunder for a signal." So that was the verdict. Pretty, but wrong. I should have known better than to try symmetry on a man who loathed it outside of orchids. Wolfe pushed his plate aside, wiped his fingers with a cloth napkin, and spoke with the calm detachment of a man lecturing on chessboard ethics. "Let us, then, reconstruct it without the comfort of elegance. Suppose Vale and Bainbridge were indeed in league. Suppose Bainbridge possessed documentation, damning, volatile. Suppose Vale, fearing betrayal or prosecution, arranged to silence him." He paused, but he failed, or miscalculated. He killed the wrong man. I leaned back. Then the real target survived. Wolfe shook his head. The error was in identity, not intention. He struck one, thinking it was the other. The confusion was not ours alone. He tapped the edge of his desk once with his middle finger, a gesture I'd learned to interpret as contemplative frustration. "An impersonator was inserted," he said. "Deliberately or opportunistically. Someone, perhaps Lorna Fielding, knew the plan and altered it. Why? To protect someone or condemn them. That narrows it down." He glanced at me with something like pity. "No, Archie, it does the opposite. It means we must question not motive, but assumption." And I could already tell he was enjoying it. The front door slammed with the subtlety of a police raid, which meant only one thing. Kramer had arrived and was not bringing pastry. He entered the office with the momentum of a locomotive and the facial temperature of a man ready to sear a confession out of mahogany. "You!" he barked at Wolfe. "You've been sitting on this, sitting, while I chase a ghost across the boroughs." Wolfe barely glanced up from his chair. "Good morning, Inspector." Kramer loomed. "Don't start with me, Wolfe. I just got word. The man I've been tracking isn't even real. Vale, Bainbridge, whoever he was, he's a phantom. You knew. Don't lie." "I know nothing," Wolfe said mildly. "That has not been confirmed by the morgue." "You think this is a joke?" Wolfe reached for his beer. "I think," he said, "that you are frustrated by your own limitations and have come here for absolution. You will not find it." Kramer's cigar snapped in half between his fingers. "I swear, Wolfe." "No need to swear," Wolfe murmured. "You're here. That's oath enough." Kramer paced the room like a wind-up bulldog, jaw tight, shoes loud, and eyes twitching for an excuse. Wolfe let him rage, then picked up the clipped newspaper from the Gazette's crime column and turned it toward him. "This," he said, "appeared this morning. It includes details from the autopsy not released to the press." Kramer didn't look. "You're suggesting I leaked it?" "I'm suggesting someone from the district attorney's office did. You may defend them if you wish, but you will be wasting your breath." Kramer stopped moving. "No one in my office would—" "But someone did." There was a pause, not long, but full of meaning. "I'll check." Wolfe smiled faintly. "No need. The damage is done. The question is not who spoke, but why." Kramer grunted. "You think it was to throw us off?" "No, Inspector. I think it was to guide us, carefully, and with purpose." He stood, a rare occurrence. "Which means," he said, "someone knows where we're headed and would rather we arrive late." I met Kramer's eyes. He didn't like that either. Roy Brisby wasn't the type to run. He was the type who walked fast enough to look busy and slow enough to avoid being remembered. I followed him from a cab stand on 34th, trailing at the regulation 2-block distance, watching him dodge puddles with the care of a man trying to preserve more than just leather soles. He turned east, crossed Lexington, and entered a grey stone building with a plaque that read Delcourt Medical Associates. Not a hospital, not quite a clinic either, the kind of place where money goes to hide behind framed credentials and ambient music. I waited 5 minutes, then followed him through a pair of revolving doors and into a lobby that smelled of fresh plastic and filtered regret. Brisby signed in at the front desk, mumbled something about a personnel file, and vanished down a corridor labelled Research Access Only. I stayed behind. Loitering isn't as glamorous as it sounds, but it pays off if you know where to lean. 15 minutes later, he came back out empty-handed and rattled, which meant whatever he'd brought had stayed behind, and whatever he'd seen hadn't helped his appetite. He walked out like the walls had whispered something he wasn't ready to believe. So naturally, I went in. The trick to impersonating a courier is confidence, not costume. I had no uniform, no clipboard, and no delivery, but I had a straight spine and a tone that suggested the person who questioned me would regret it. "Document drop for Dr. Heller," I said, breezing past the desk. Dr. Heller, as luck would have it, didn't exist. The third door on the left was marked Records, Clinical Trials Internal Only. It was locked, but only in the sense that a paperclip and a little charm couldn't resolve. I slipped inside, flipped the overhead switch, and started browsing. Row after row of alphabetical sin, trial results, dosage sheets, incident logs, and near the back, under B, a folder marked Bainbridge, non-final, redacted. I opened it. 17 patient names, all flagged. 3 adverse outcomes, 1 fatality. The notes were sparse, but the red pencil was precise. I slid the folder into my coat. As I stepped into the hall, I passed a man in a white coat who looked at me too long. He didn't speak. I didn't pause. But I made a mental note of his shoes and the fact that they didn't squeak. The air outside had thickened, the kind of fog that doesn't roll in so much as appear when your back is turned. I kept my pace steady, hands in pockets, eyes forward. But somewhere between 51st and Park, I felt it. A presence. It wasn't the kind that breathes down your neck, more like a shadow that chooses not to cast one. He stayed 3 lengths behind, close enough to monitor but not to menace. Long coat, dark brim, no umbrella. The kind of man who belonged in a noir reel, if only he hadn't been walking with surgical silence. I ducked into a bodega and pretended to browse toothpaste. He stopped. Not at the door, but across the street, pretending to examine a newspaper box that had been empty for 2 days. I stepped out. He resumed. The man had patience, I'll give him that. But he lacked subtlety. I made for the brownstone, the file tucked under my arm, the weight of knowledge growing by the block, and behind me the rhythm of footsteps that weren't mine. The rain had returned by the time I turned onto 35th. Wolfe's brownstone was lit, its windows gold with Fritz's punctuality, and Wolfe's refusal to believe in overhead fixtures. I'd just mounted the stoop when I heard the stagger behind me. It was the man, the one who'd followed me from Delcourt. He stepped onto the bottom stair, eyes vacant, lips parted like he meant to speak. Then he dropped, not slumped, dropped. By the time I reached him, he was gone, not unconscious, not merely winded, gone, no wallet, no phone, no watch. But there was one item, a cuff link in his right palm, cracked clean across the center, brass with a medical emblem etched in the enamel. I turned it over. The initials had been filed off. Inside, Wolfe was finishing his beer. I told him what had happened. Poison, he said instantly. Fast-acting, ingested or injected. Likely the former. A safeguard. For what? He looked at the file I was still holding. For that, he said. And I understood just then that whoever was controlling the story had just burned a page. It's not every day you step over a corpse to get into the office, but in this line of work, the unusual has a nasty habit of becoming routine. The man on our stoop was neatly dressed in a grey raincoat, 30-something, Caucasian, with a build suggesting quiet strength and a face suggesting nothing at all. I knelt beside him while Kramer growled down the front steps like the body was my fault. "No ID," he muttered. "No wallet, no license, not even a laundry ticket." "Dental work?" I offered. "Yeah, foreign. You want a souvenir?" I didn't. The only thing the man had on him, besides rigor mortis and rainwater, was a broken brass cufflink with a medical emblem carved halfway through the enamel. The other half had either been snapped off by someone else or left behind on purpose. Kramer stood. "You're going to tell me this has nothing to do with you?" I could try. He jabbed a finger at me. "Wolfe's involved. He always is when the bodies don't bring their names." And with that, we both turned to the door where Wolfe was waiting, not to greet us, but to judge. Once the front door had been resecured and the unfortunate guest removed under municipal authority, Wolfe summoned me to the office with the gravity of a coroner calling next of kin. "You retrieved the file?" he said. I did, and I wasn't the only one interested. He nodded once, not approval, not surprise, just acknowledgement of a minor variable confirming a larger pattern. He tapped the folder on his desk. "This is no longer information," he said. "It is leverage, and for someone it became evidence worth killing over. Bainbridge's audit, more than that, a map of malpractice, signatures, dates, an anatomy of collusion. And the man on the steps?" "A courier," Wolfe said calmly. "One sent to retrieve it before we could decode it." "By whom?" He looked at me. If I knew that, Mr. Goodwin, the conversation would already be over. I poured myself a glass of water I didn't want. This wasn't about discovery anymore. This was about containment. And Wolfe had just declared the perimeter breached. It's not often Wolfe treats the brownstone like a fortress, but when he does it means war. He locked the front door, double-bolted the kitchen entry, and informed Fritz that for the foreseeable future, groceries would be delivered to the rear alley and retrieved by me with gloves. "This house," he declared, "is no longer a domicile. It is a crucible. Anyone entering from this point forward does so under interrogation." "Which makes you what? The chemist or the flame?" Wolfe ignored me. He sent a brief note to Inspector Kramer, handwritten, with signature and seal, informing him of our seclusion. The note was to be respected, not replied to. Then he looked at me and said, "Phone Eloise Bainbridge. Tell her we require her presence immediately." "Shall I say why?" "You shall say nothing. The necessity will suffice." I made the call. Then I called Rusterman's and ordered enough food to last us through a siege. I had a feeling it wouldn't just be dinner that got dissected. Eloise Bainbridge arrived 27 minutes after the call, her coat thrown over a blouse that didn't match and her lipstick half applied, like she'd lost the time or the will to finish dressing. She didn't sit until Wolfe told her to, and even then she didn't relax into the chair. Her fingers trembled once, then steadied, and she folded them neatly over her handbag, as though trying to remind herself she still had control over something. Wolfe regarded her like a surgeon might regard a closed wound, certain something lay beneath, but determined not to rush the incision. "Madam," he said, "you are here because the consequences of a mission have exceeded their utility." She swallowed once. "I didn't mean to mislead you," she said. "Not at first." That distinction no longer holds. There was a long silence. Then she inhaled. Not deeply, but deliberately. "My husband had files," she said. "Names, signatures, trial dates, side effects. He kept them hidden. He planned to give them to the press. He had a contact. And they found out." Wolfe leaned forward, the slightest motion. "Who?" She looked at her hands. "Everyone," she whispered. "The hospital board, the device reps, even the man he trusted to protect him." Her voice cracked. "He never even told me his name." Wolfe's voice, when it finally came, was gentler than I expected, and somehow more dangerous because of it. "Madam, I shall assume you are not being deliberately obtuse. Who exactly did your husband intend to expose?" Eloise Bainbridge lifted her eyes. There was no anger there now, only the stunned fatigue of someone who'd spent months trying to smother a fire with silk gloves. "Surgical devices," she said. "Some were never approved, others were defective." Lennox found discrepancies in trial results, edits to patient logs, missing reports. He traced them to a company called Mediant Wolfe, closed his eyes briefly, as if the name had been waiting in his mind for its cue. He believed, she continued, that the hospital administrators were being paid to push the devices through internal approvals. A few doctors went along, most didn't know. And Dr. Bainbridge? He knew, she said, and he thought truth would protect him. Wolfe opened his eyes. They were not sympathetic. "Then he committed an error," he said softly. "Truth protects no one until it's already out." Wolfe rose, which he rarely does without cause, and turned to the chalkboard that until this point had held only an idle quote from Euripides and a few looping notations about ferry departures. He erased them with one stroke of the cloth and began, methodically, to write. "Vale," he said aloud as though instructing himself. "Alias C.L. Van, known to Lorna Fielding, recently travelled under multiple identities." He scrawled it on the left. "Brisby," I added, because I know my job. "Medical liaison, had access to clinical trials, followed by me to a research wing and tried to shred a patient log before I showed up." "Cowardice, not initiative," Wolfe muttered. "He fears exposure more than prison." He added Carla Reyes beneath them. "Evaporated," he said. "Too early, too completely." And then Eloise. "Her grief is authentic," Wolfe declared, "but incomplete. She protected the memory of her husband more than the man himself." I didn't argue. The names on the board had started to circle one another: motive, opportunity, pressure. They weren't puzzle pieces, they were fractures. Wolfe wasn't trying to assemble. He was listening for the break. I've been in that office through all kinds of atmospheres. Tense, amused, acidic, triumphant. But that afternoon it felt like we were sitting inside a lung that had just drawn breath but refused to exhale. Wolfe wasn't speaking, which is when he's doing his most dangerous thinking. The air thickened. I watched his eyes follow the scribbles on the board like they were constellations. I could see the motive. I could trace the money. But what I couldn't see was the hinge, the moment it all turned. Why switch identities? Why the ferry? And why the hell send a corpse to our front door without a calling card? I turned the questions over like cards in a losing hand. Wolfe didn't help. He only said, "Not yet," which for him was practically shouting. So I did what I do when the game goes quiet. I checked the calendar, the notes, the ink in the pen. And then Wolfe moved. Not much, just his hand, but enough to signal that the breath was about to release. Without turning from the board, Wolfe said, "Archie." I stopped midway through a sentence I wasn't writing and looked up. "Get me the Staten Island ferry schedule," he said. "From 3 weeks ago, Wednesday." That was all. No explanation, no hypothesis, no arched brow, just the request. Sharp as a scalpel and equally surgical. "Any particular reason?" "I don't answer rhetorical questions," he replied. "Not before dinner." That meant something had clicked. I just hadn't heard the sound yet. I called the Port Authority and requested a copy. The man on the other end asked if I was press. I told him I was the worse alternative. Curious. 20 minutes later, a fax came through. Wolfe waited until I laid the pages in front of him before lifting his eyes. He didn't scan them like a reader. He read them like a man translating runes. Then his lips moved. Just a murmur. "One boat. One time." And then he did something he hadn't done all week. He smiled, only with the corners. But it was enough to raise my pulse. Something had moved, and now we were all going with it. It wasn't a séance, though it looked enough like one to make me wonder if we needed candles. 8 chairs had been positioned by Fritz, Wolfe's instructions, not mine, in a crescent arc around his desk, close enough for eye contact, but far enough to avoid homicide. The brownstone hadn't seen this much tension since the tax assessor tried to itemize the orchid room. The cast was familiar, if not friendly. Kramer was planted like a bulldog with arthritis, biting on a cigar he hadn't lit. Eloise Bainbridge sat stiff as wire, her hands folded like she was praying for a lie to hold. Brisby mopped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief and kept glancing at the door. Lorna Fielding had a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Carla Reyes, back from her unexplained hiatus, crossed her legs too slowly to be accidental. There were others, lesser orbiters in this solar system of trouble, but Wolfe ignored them all equally. He sat behind his desk like Jupiter in a chair, silent, still, composed, watching. I stayed by the globe bar, arms crossed, waiting. The river of truth, as always, would rise. Once Wolfe broke the dam. Wolfe didn't raise his voice, but he didn't have to. When he begins a monologue, the room quiets the way a cathedral does, not out of reverence, but inevitability. "We begin," he said, "with geography." The ferry departed Staten Island at 7:40 p.m. and docked at Whitehall Terminal at precisely 8:10. That window, ladies and gentlemen, is not generous. It is surgical. The murder occurred within it, therefore it was either planned in advance or executed with an intimacy that defies chance. Brisby shifted. Carla blinked twice. Wolfe, as ever, noticed. There is no evidence of forced entry, no sign of violence beyond the wound itself. A man was killed with the precision of someone who understood the anatomy of both flesh and opportunity. He picked up a sheet of notepaper and flicked it once with his index finger. No one boarded mid-river, no phantoms slipped in from fog or water. This was no outsider's hand. Whoever killed Lennox Bainbridge was already on the ferry, or already in his life. He paused long enough to let the facts settle like dust on conscience. And then, gently, "The map is drawn. Now we find the path." If Wolfe's tone had shifted, it was only by a fraction, from magistrate to biographer. The story he told next had weight behind it, the kind that makes silence feel like a verdict. Marcus Vale and Lennox Bainbridge were not strangers, he began. They were, in fact, co-authors of a private enterprise, one which involved coercing silence from individuals whose professional indiscretions made them vulnerable. Eloise looked as though someone had vacuumed the air from her lungs. Kramer leaned forward, jaw set. They compiled data about devices, approvals, patients. They wrote letters, unsigned. They suggested that reputations could be preserved for a price. Wolfe's lip curled slightly. It was not original, nor especially artful, but it was lucrative until Vale disappeared, along with a considerable sum. "And Bainbridge?" I asked, because someone had to. He attempted to follow, Wolfe said, but failed. There it was, simple, cold. The victim wasn't merely a doctor with ethics. He was a man who had dipped his hands in tar and found it didn't wash off in the Hudson. Wolfe turned slightly, not toward the room, but inward, like he'd come to the final clause of a long, complex sentence. "There is, however, one more figure in this tableau," he said, "a presence not accounted for by evidence, but by inference." Lorna Fielding straightened, but Wolfe didn't look at her. Someone saw the transaction unfold, perhaps not the money itself, but the switch, the names, the exit plans, someone who was positioned to observe without being observed. Carla opened her mouth, then closed it again. Wolfe's gaze slid toward the middle distance. "A ferry employee," he said, "not merely passing through, but placed. Routine makes people invisible. We trust the hands that collect tickets, the voices that call out terminals." Now he looked at Lorna. "You had access. You had motive. You knew when Bainbridge boarded. And, crucially, you knew he wouldn't reach the other side." Lorna's smile vanished like a light switch flicked. The silence wasn't just hot anymore, it was sharp. And I, for one, could feel the river turning under us all. Wolfe's voice had grown quieter, which meant the weight was growing heavier. The room had taken on the hush of a confessional. not that I expected absolution. "Miss Fielding," he said without turning, "there are two stories that belong to you. One is the death you gave, the other is the death you received." Her jaw tightened. Her knuckles whitened on the armrests. "Your brother was not the intended patient. He was a healthy man, a volunteer, coerced into a drug trial for a device that had not passed clinical scrutiny. He trusted a name. That name was Bainbridge." Silence, but for the ticking of the desk clock. "He died in 42 minutes. No autopsy followed. The paperwork disappeared with the consultant. No noise, no investigation, only a paycheck issued to a grieving sister under the table." Kramer stirred, but Wolfe lifted one hand. "You took the Ferry job afterward, not for the view, but for proximity. You watched, you waited." He turned, at last. "And when Bainbridge changed his name to Vale, you saw only one thing, a man escaping judgment." Lorna didn't speak, but her silence bent inward, sharp as glass. "The mistake," Wolfe continued, "was his wound. He let that linger, which meant I was free to translate. I moved toward the globe bar and leaned one shoulder against it, theatrics being part of my job description. "You mean the stab?" I said. "I mean the symmetry," Wolfe replied. "Both victims, the man on the ferry and the man on my doorstep, bore incisions of identical depth, identical angle, right fifth intercostal space, quick, quiet, designed to sever and silence." Kramer shifted, his expression narrowing to a scowl with teeth. "That suggests one of two things," Wolfe went on. "Either the killer was exceedingly lucky twice, or she was exceedingly trained once." He let his gaze rest on Lorna again. "Miss Fielding was a combat medic. Honorable discharge. Records sealed, but not to me. She spent 18 months in Kandahar. Triage in a tent where speed outweighed sentiment." Lorna's eyes had gone still. Not panicked, not pleading. Just still. "You knew how to make it look clean," Wolfe said softly. "Because you were trained to save, which means you knew precisely how to end." There it was. Not accusation, not speculation, just logic, surgical and final. It didn't break like in the movies. No tears, no trembling confession, just a sudden inhale through clenched teeth and a voice that cut like a scalpel. "You want the truth?" Lorna snapped. "He killed my brother." Then he smiled through the paperwork and called it unforeseen complications. The silence that followed was sharp enough to shave with. Wolfe leaned back, impassive. "I followed him. I waited. I was going to let him rot in his own guilt, but he never did. He ran. Changed his name. Found a new scam." Her eyes flicked to Eloise Bainbridge, whose face had gone waxen. "I stabbed him on the ferry," Lorna said. "That was justice." "And the second?" I asked, because Wolfe would have considered it vulgar. She looked at me, no longer cold, just tired. "Because I knew I'd missed. The first one wasn't Bainbridge. He switched places with someone else, so I finished what I started." That was when Wolfe, at last, closed his eyes. Not from relief, from the inevitability of what comes next when someone's told you the truth. The room hadn't breathed yet when Lorna moved. I saw her eyes flick, not toward Wolfe, but toward me. My right hip, to be exact. And I'll say this. Whatever war she came back from, it hadn't dulled her reflexes. She went for it. Fast, hard, and with the kind of intent that empties a room in bad dreams. But her judgment was about a quarter-second off, and I wasn't the type to hand over a revolver to someone with a fresh confession and a dead look. I caught her wrist just before her fingers met steel and twisted, not hard enough to break, but hard enough to make a point. The weapon stayed where it belonged, holstered. My grip stayed where it needed to be, firm. Lorna froze, then exhaled something between a sob and a hiss. I guided her back into the chair with all the gentleness a woman like that deserved, which was to say, plenty. Wolfe opened his eyes. "Archie." "She's done," I said. The room had reset, but not to calm, only to truth, bruised, and staring at itself in the mirror. By the time the sun rose over 35th Street the next morning, the newspapers had gotten louder, but the brownstone had done what it always did. Once Wolfe declared a case closed, it folded back in on itself like a carnivorous plant after a meal. Wolfe sat in the big chair, tilted at a fractional angle only Fritz and I could recognize as satisfaction. He had a glass of his oldest beer sweating on the coaster beside him, and orchids before him that, in his words, required more sympathy than the human race ever deserved. The man hadn't spoken since breakfast, which, considering we'd just helped untangle a scheme involving a ferryboat medic with a grudge, a dead whistleblower, and a file folder that had the weight of 20 lawsuits, was either restraint or smugness. I was leaning toward both. The phone rang twice and went unanswered. The doorbell tried once. Wolfe didn't twitch. The world outside could howl, publish, accuse, and admire. Inside, the routine was unshaken. Silence, orchids, beer, and one oversized brain ticking with thoughts it didn't plan on sharing, yet. I had taken to reading the paper aloud that morning, partly out of habit, partly because Fritz had slipped out for fresh herbs and Wolfe needed something to ignore. "A reluctant savant in West 35th Street," I quoted, eyes on the post, "whose passion for orchids is rivaled only by his contempt for human folly." Wolfe sipped. No flicker. "Inspector Kramer declined to comment," I added, but sources suggest the final break in the case came from within the walls of the detective's own home. A grunt, possibly indigestion, possibly pride, in the way Mount Rushmore might express gratitude. I folded the paper. "You're a reluctant savant now. That's a promotion from insufferable gastronome." He exhaled through his nose, a feat of monumental patience, and said, "The only thing more foolish than solving a case is publicizing it." "Then congratulations," I said. "We've been foolish on two fronts." The paper stayed folded. Wolfe stayed silent. But I'd caught the corner of his lip move, ever so slightly, before he reached again for the beer. The first indication we weren't quite alone in the House of Peace was the smell of cigar smoke that drifted in before the man himself. I don't blame the cigar. It was the company it kept. "Goodwin," Kramer barked. "He in?" Wolfe didn't stir. I tilted my head toward the office. Kramer barged in like he was still holding a warrant that hadn't expired, lit his cigar without asking, and stood just far enough from Wolfe's desk to signal civility without warmth. "You know," he said, exhaling, "I still don't like how you handle things." "I wouldn't expect you to," Wolfe replied. "Your professional ethic is reactive, mine is reconstructive." "Hell it is," Kramer growled. "You turned that whole mess into a parlor lecture and let a killer confess because you cornered her like a chess piece." Wolfe raised his eyebrows. "Would you rather she'd run?" Kramer didn't answer that. He chewed the cigar, said nothing, then muttered, "Next time don't call me after you've tied the bow." And then, almost as an afterthought, "But good work." He left with the smoke trailing behind him. The rarest of gifts. Kramer's version of a thank you. When the door shut behind Kramer, Wolfe didn't resume his silence, which I'll admit startled me more than the visit. He reached for the beer, took a contemplative sip, and spoke with the gravity of a man introducing a Latin aphorism to a jury. "There is anatomy," he said, "and there is moral anatomy. The former obeys the laws of blood and bone. The latter is infinitely more surgical." I raised a brow. "You thinking of a new career? Forensics?" "No," he replied. "But this case, this tangle of vengeance and disguise, has reminded me how few men grasp the nature of clean incisions." He leaned back. "When a physician cuts, he knows the body yields by design, but when one dissects a lie, a motive, an act born of grief or greed, the resistance is not physical, it is spiritual." I stayed quiet, mostly because I knew he wasn't done. "There is no anesthesia for the truth," he said softly. "Not for the one who wields it. Certainly not for the one who feels it." Then he looked at me. "I wonder which bleeds more." It wasn't a question for an answer, just one of those questions that stay. Later that afternoon, with Wolfe having retreated to the orchids and Fritz back in the kitchen rendering a duck, I did the necessary clerical act that always feels vaguely sacramental. I packed up the Bainbridge file. The folder was thick. Photographs, statements, a Ferry timetable with red ink smudged from Wolfe's thumb. I put it in the cabinet under B and slid the drawer shut. That was how we labelled things around here, not by sentiment but by surname and circumstance. The category was completed, but that word, in Wolfe's taxonomy, rarely meant resolved, only discontinued. Like a train line rerouted, not dismantled. I sat back for a moment and looked at the other folders, cases where lies had been lanced, truths spooled out like old thread, and people had walked away less innocent but more whole. Bainbridge wouldn't be one of them. Still, I filed it, because the act of filing, like Wolfe's silence, wasn't closure. It was discipline. By the time dusk turned the window panes violet, I found myself in the front room, the quiet companion of a chair and a half-burned sky. I looked out at the world and thought, for once, not about suspects or motives, but ferries. There's something strange about the way a ferry crosses water. It's not linear, it curves with the current. A back-and-forth motion pretending to be forward, like justice, maybe. Bainbridge, or Vale, or whatever name he finally claimed, had tried to skip out across that water, but names aren't lifeboats, and guilt, when it travels, leaves a wake. Then there was Lorna. She had ridden that same ferry. Only she wasn't escaping. She was circling, waiting for the right pier to dock her revenge. Some people cross rivers to forget, some to forgive, and some just to return with a weapon sharper than memory. I pulled my gaze back inside, to the lamp, the case folders, the silence Wolfe had left behind him like a second coat on a hook. A ferry moves you forward, but it always starts where you were. And the crossing, I thought, was never the hard part. It's where you arrive. There's a moment, after a case is done, when everything you chased becomes something you carry. Not like a burden. More like a passport stamp you didn't ask for, but will never erase. I sat in Wolfe's chair, not out of presumption, just proximity, and thought about that shoreline we'd landed on. Was justice served? Maybe. Lorna would face trial, the clinic would face exposure, and Bainbridge, well, he'd already faced what he most feared, being seen. But justice, Wolfe once told me, is not a perfect equation. It's a tide. Sometimes it lifts the innocent. Sometimes it drags the guilty. And sometimes it simply washes everyone in mud until someone claims to feel clean. I looked at the orchids. Still, silent, absurdly pure. Then I said it aloud just to see if the room would argue. We made the crossing. Maybe we didn't bring everyone home, but we docked on the right shore. No one answered. But the silence didn't feel empty, just reflective. And I figured that was enough. The ferry docked, the fog lifted, and the names, false and forgotten, settled into silence. Wolfe, unmoved by applause, let justice find its own form, not clean, not pretty, but precise. And somewhere between a brother's grave and a forged signature, truth rose, not to comfort, but to clarify. Archie filed the folder, but not the weight it carried. What do you think? Was Lorna's act a crime of the heart, or a heart long broken by crime? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.